Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're still, people are still coming in, so we're waiting just for the waiting room to clear, and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jesse Carter. I'm with the Texas Department of State Health Services. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar as part of the Achieving Together conversation series. Achieving Together is the Texas HIV Ending HIV Plan. It's a community-driven plan that was built and owned by stakeholders across the state, and we're really excited as we roll it out. It began last year and will continue on. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to achievingtogethertx.org to learn more, and there'll be more information later on. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are also live streaming on YouTube today. So if you have questions as we go along, you can enter those in the comments, either here in the webinar on Zoom. You can enter comments in the chat, or you can enter any questions you have in the comment section on YouTube. We have folks monitoring both of those. There will be time at the end of the presentations today to answer questions. So as we go along, go ahead and enter your questions as, into those chat functions. Slides and other additional information will be made available at the end of the webinar. We'll be sending out more information, and all of that will be available. A recording of the webinar will also be made available after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Oscar Lopez, who's the Executive Director of Poderosos here in Texas, who will be leading the conversation today. Thank you. Oscar?
Thank you, Jesse, and all the folks at Achieving Together. We're really happy to do this. My partner in crime, Ricky Prieto, have been working on this issue for over a year, but we struggled to find support for moving that forward. So voila, we created our own organization, and here we are. We've been doing a lot of on the ground, as well as research, as well as everything that's come out most recently from researchers 2019 and 2020. So all the data we will be sharing is current and most up to date. A couple of disclaimers that right now, the slide that you see says the impact of meth on HIV, Latinx, gay, and bi men, and MSM, because there's a huge difference between those populations. But for the sake of brevity, as we move forward, they'll be referred to as MSM after this slide, simply because government-wise, funding-wise, that's how we're clumped in, but also because of space on slides. We initially created this for Texas, but when we saw how well it was turning out, and then when Jeffrey Crowley and Sean Bland with the O'Neill Institute, who you'll meet, joined us, we decided to open it up to the rest of y'all. And now, hopefully everybody who signed up will be here, but they represent, so far I'm looking at California, Georgia, Louisiana. So God bless, we're all glad you're with us, and we'll do our best to do a good job. I've been a little under the weather for those of you who registered earlier for the previous one. I had a burst ulcer, 2 endoscopies. I've not healed, but now they think I contracted COVID at the surgical center. So if you see me winded or needing to drink a lot of water, that's why. But we're here. Thank you all. I'll pass it on to Rick.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Here's a brief overview of the objectives. We're going to discuss the health risks for men who have sex with men in regards to methamphetamines. We'll discuss the scope of the epidemic and its impact on HIV prevention and HIV overall. We'll discuss meth as a tool to enhance sexual experience and promoting connection and intimacy. We'll also discuss the lack of access to culturally competent mental and behavioral health services, and then just generally lessons learned from working with this population and recommendations for providers, service providers, people in public health working on this topic.
So just to give you a little bit about background, we want to make sure that service providers understand harm reduction, HIV risk behaviors, as well as the history and culture of communities they're serving. And this moves beyond just being culturally competent, because I think we've all sat through too many of those workshops, that they haven't always been effective. Part of that reason is we don't often hire the right staff. We don't train them appropriately, especially around harm reduction, what that really means, which in turn means that organizations sometimes are not using the right messaging, the right advertising, making it unsafe for people who are users to disclose their use of any illegal substance. Much more so also important is that those environments make it unsafe for staff to go to their supervisors or HR directors with their problem, asking for help for fear of termination. I can tell you real quickly that I was first introduced to meth in New York City. My jobs while there and in DC had me traveling all over the country. And no matter where I went, if I went out to any establishment that was gay oriented, a restaurant, a bar, a nightclub, or online, meth was always offered to me. And I dabbled to the point where I worried about myself. I'm now in recovery, but it's a slippery slope because I've fallen off and I come back on and doing really well now. But very important to know that those environments need to make it okay for us and our clients to be open and honest. We know that Latinx MSM are using methamphetamine, and that there's a limited guidance and resources specifically targeted for working with this community. Often providers don't, sorry, something came up on my slide. Forgive me. Are uninformed about the community who uses meth, how they use it, what it does to their bodies, how it makes them more sexually aggressive, and then the fallout of that, of course, being joblessness, homelessness, and for Latino MSM, who many times contribute to the well-being financially and emotionally of their families, living in multi-generational homes. If you don't have a job and you're a drug user, you're out. And then where do you go? So it's a spiral.
So here's a brief 101 on what is meth. You'll see some pictures on the right-hand side. Methamphetamine is a powerful, highly addictive stimulant. It affects the central nervous system, among other things. It's a form of the drug that looks like glass fragments, shiny bluish white rocks. It is chemically similar to amphetamine and other things like Adderall that are used to treat ADD, narcolepsy, sleep disorders. Some of the other names that you'll hear, particularly on apps, if people are soliciting for drugs or to party and play, you'll hear it's called crystal, ice, meth, Tina, speed. It acts as an upper to make people feel more awake, more active, skin sensitive, and of course, very pertinent to this conversation, it does have a very strong sexual component to it. Like other drugs, these risks are compounded by social determinants of health, including access to resources, housing, healthcare, employment, social networks, and other aspects related to someone's social cultural identities. And we will get into that a little further.
And to that effect about social networks, apps, we have to be truly honest with ourselves, especially those of us who are older and either grew up in the gay community or allies of the gay community. Much of our HIV prevention work happened in bars, nightclubs, those establishments. They no longer exist. They are dying left and right, which makes outreach to those populations more challenging. There's very few organizations, very few, I can count them on one hand that I know of, that are doing effective online outreach. But there's no federal effort, no national effort to hold Atom for Atom, Grindr, Scruff, and others accountable for how easy it is for someone to advertise that they party and play, or that they're looking for drugs, or that they're selling drugs. And so that's something that's going to be a challenge moving forward. In terms of how meth works, you can smoke it, and within 30 to 60 seconds, you can feel the effects, a little bit of tingle. It makes you want to smoke more, and the vapors inhaled to the lungs. Right now, we're working with some folks who just released information about how vaping makes teenagers more susceptible to COVID. Nothing is being done to demonstrate how meth smoking also might do the same, but the process is similar. You can snort it, grind it up as fine as you can, inhale it through the nose. You get a huge rush. You use more of the drug, but the effect is longer lasting. You can inject it within 3 to 7 seconds to feel the effects, using the needle to inject directly to the vein. Now, a lot of folks are still are pushing for needle exchange, syringe exchange. I totally agree that that has to happen. But what we've discovered in our research and work here in the field and across the country is that a lot of meth users are very bright about not sharing needles. So that's not, I think, the highest risk. It's what you do when you're high, regardless of what your intake was. You can insert meth by diluting it in a little bit of water, and then using an airdropper or even a syringe without a needle into the anus, hopefully with a little bit of lube. Dispelling the water with meth into your anus. And you're supposed to wait 15 to 20 minutes to feel the effect. But if you do this halfway through a sex session, which may last a few hours to a day to 4 or 5 days, you may not wait 15 to 20 minutes. I've also personally seen people who will take a shard of meth, which again looks and feels like glass, and insert it directly into their rectum with lube. They try and wait, but if 20 minutes or longer haven't gone by, especially because it wasn't diluted, we're talking shards that'll affect the penis and the anal lining. You can also swallow it by just taking a shard. You can wrap it up in a little bit of toilet paper or directly put in the back of your mouth, swallow it, and 15, 30 minutes later, you'll feel the effects. Go ahead and go, Ricky, to the next one.
All right. Some of the short-term effects, and these happen very quickly. Increased confidence and motivation, which definitely plays into the sexuality associated with meth use. Feelings of euphoria, reduced inhibitions. You'll notice dilated pupils. It does dry out your mouth. Increased heart rate, reduced appetite, which for a lot of people is one of the positive things about it. You don't get hungry, and you're also not sleeping as much. It does kind of cause some production in this or secretional and sweat glands, so there is an excess of sweating. There's an increased libido, but at the same time, kind of paradoxically, erection loss is also associated with meth use. So you'll see it combined a lot with Viagra and other pills to address that issue. It'll damage the nasal passages if when it's snorted. Like I said earlier, inability to sleep. And though the effects of meth abuse are not as rapid as far as what you could physically observe, relative to maybe heroin or painkillers, it does take a very visible toll. After a few months of regular ingestion, whether it's snorted or injected, you'll begin to notice, again, extreme weight loss, poor skin, acne breaking out, nail and scalp health, sores and scabs that are a lot of times the result of just scratching, whether through paranoia or just excess use, extreme mood swings and irritability, and multiple days and nights without sleep. Now, binges can last for days at a time, nights at a time. By the end of them, the user is going to be particularly surly, aggressive. Their personality is going to have significant changes, as well as their physical appearance. And so in a few short months, an individual who consistently uses meth, they will be physically and behaviorally a very different person. Now, meth use can also result in effects such as cardiovascular and cerebrovascular dysfunction and mortality, depression, anxiety, cognitive deficits, psychosis, violence, and suicidal ideation. In fact, suicide has been estimated to account for 18% of all methamphetamine-related deaths, and approximately 1/3 of people who are addicted to meth report having attempted suicide one or more times. So that's obviously a very alarming number there, and it's just kind of the nature of the drug. It has very high highs, but the lows are very low. And so despite these health effects, meth use is reinforced by alleviating or removing the uncomfortable or aversive states within the body. And I think this is true of a lot of drugs. This is called negative reinforcement. You're depressed, you're particularly now with the pandemic, people are unemployed, you're living with people that maybe ordinarily you wouldn't because of your housing situation. Meth is a way to kind of numb yourself to all that, to get some kind of euphoria. But because meth does have these short-term effects, the negative reinforcement is, well, let me just do more. Individuals continue to use meth despite the negative consequences to alleviate states or sensations associated with negative moods, tension, arousal, craving, and withdrawal. And as Oscar will discuss shortly, once you have sex on methamphetamine, it becomes something that becomes intimately tied to your sexual experience. And so, these uncomfortable states are a result of prolonged meth use itself, but may also be a pre-existing condition, which meth can be a maladaptive coping mechanism to deal with.
If I can say something there, Rick. Also, I think the other thing that we have to take into account is how much pornography has played into, and pornography with barebacking has played into the meth and HIV epidemic. I'll admit it, I've watched porn in my lifetime, but what's different is that the pornography has changed. It is much more aggressive. You can search raw, you can see people shooting up online and then having sex with multiple partners. And for last year, I personally taught 16,000 junior high and high school students across 4 school districts here in South Texas on the border. And when I asked them, frankly, where do you get your sex education? Where did you learn about sex? Every single one of them said through pornography. So that's a huge issue.
Absolutely. Some of the other maybe more long-term effects are, and this is kind of stereotypically depicted like in films and TV, so-called meth mouth, which is because of damage to the teeth and gums, because it can dehydrate you. Of course, liver damage, kidney damage, high body temperature, which can lead to brain damage, rapid heart rate, arrhythmia, and other cardiac issues that can lead to stroke. And these all work together to contribute to sudden death in some cases. If meth is used in conjunction with other drugs, heroin, alcohol, or if needles are used as a method of ingestion, then of course more risks arise, the risk of death increases. And we do see meth used in conjunction with other drugs, particularly in the so-called come down. When you're coming down and you haven't slept in days, a lot of people are turning to benzodiazepines like Xanax and Ativan, to alcohol. It's well known that with stimulants, you can drink much more than you ordinarily could. So these are all compounding, the health effects on your body. And last is meth psychosis, psychotics, which is psychotic symptoms and syndromes, which are frequently experienced among MSM who use meth, with recent estimates of approximately 40% of users affected. This is typically kind of an intermittent kind of experience of psychosis that is a result of not sleeping for days, of doing just an excess amount of the drug. But of course, if people have pre-existing conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar, then meth use will exacerbate that. So,
While you were speaking, Rick, somebody mentioned that that more support and funding and all that is available in New York. That's to that point.
Fantastic.
I wish everybody else could be like New York. we'd also be seeing a lowering of COVID cases nationwide. But you are blessed to work there, and
Yes.
thank you for
I think
that.
San Francisco, LA, New York are definitely leaders in that regard. Yeah. Oscar, you want to take this?
Sure. So all the board, all that, sorry, I'll hope that border closings and city shutdowns would disrupt drug trafficking during the pandemic has vanished, as it's clear that the opposite is happening. Crystal meth in particular is as readily available and potent as ever. Rural areas like the one we live in on the borderlands, and that some of you live in the South, make it easier for meth labs to creep up, to produce in large quantities. If there happens to be a fire or explosion, so many of them are isolated where nobody might even notice except for some smoke in the distance. Making matters worse, many treatment centers, drug courts, and recovery programs have been forced to close or significantly scale back during the shutdowns. With plunging revenue for services and little financial relief from the government, some now tweet on the brink of financial collapse. Even before the pandemic, the nation's infrastructure for helping people with substance use disorders was underfunded and inadequate, quite frankly. Without government intervention, local officials, drug policy experts warn overdoses and deaths will continue to climb during the pandemic and the existing system that will be inundated. And Sean Bland will talk about that more in just a little bit.
Yes, there's definitely been a spike in overdose deaths since the lockdowns in April, and Sean will give us some data on that.
The prevalence of meth use among MSMs, and again, reminding everybody in case those of you who hear me late, MSM for now, for the PowerPoint, will refer to gay and bisexual men and MSM. So prevalence of meth use among MSM has been shown to be 20 times that of the general population, with an estimated 20 to 45% of MSM reporting use of meth in the context of sexual behavior in the past 6 months. That's as of 2016. Epidemiological studies among US MSM over the past 5 years demonstrate the prevalence of problematic meth use that has remained steady. Meth continues to be affordable, simple to manufacture, readily available, maintaining a broad and negative health impact nationwide. It's so readily available that most of us who would want this can call somebody. In New York, delivery was 30 minutes or less, or it's free. And here in Texas, an hour, even if they have to drive long distances, is guaranteed delivery as well. MSM users reported a decreased ability to enjoy other life activities that did not involve drug use. For many of the men, this led to their seeing continued meth use as the only way to experience pleasure. Further, problematic meth use is a complex and treatment-resistant problem. So even if all of our substance abuse behavioral health entities got more money, most won't know what to do about meth, unless, again, you're in one of the larger cities.
Yes, and as we kind of segue into HIV and methamphetamines, originally this presentation was, in partnership with Texas public health officials. So a lot of this might be focused on Texas and Latinos in particular. So this next slide is just a brief overview about HIV among Latinx men. All US Latinx people living with HIV, only 59% are receiving HIV specialized care. 49%, only 49 are retained in HIV care, and only 50% have a suppressed viral load. 26% of all new HIV diagnoses are in the Latinx community. Of those, 78% are among gay and bisexual men. New HIV infections in this group are increasing, and the greatest increase is in young men, ages 25 to 34. And of course, as many of us know, geographically, these rising new infections are in the South primarily. Okay.
In terms of why all MSM, but Latino MSM in particular, turn to using meth, again, unless you've experienced it, it's hard to picture. But what you might see in the most graphic pornographic video is what you can walk into or be invited to join, regardless of your body shape, your color, your immigration status. Oftentimes those folks, and your age, by the way, oftentimes those folks are specifically targeted to join in because of their age, their sort of naivete to the situation. So it's a challenge. And being loved on or loved in by men that are attractive boosts your self-esteem to the point where you associate that with meth and the problem continues. Among MSM living with HIV in the US, meth rates are reported between 23 to 35% and 20% among Latinos. Latinos represent 17% of the US population, but account for 21% of people living with HIV and 24% of all new infections. And as you know, because we are such an attractive people, everybody wants to have sex with us and have our babies. So between now and the next 30, 40 years, we're gonna see a tremendous explosion of Latino identified children who, will lead us to being the larger population in the United States, and all the more important that we have this information.
Yeah. And again, what you're seeing right here is from our friend Aurelio Loza, University of El Paso, University of Texas, El Paso. And what she's citing there is, again, that when we're talking about HIV as infections from meth use, it is primarily because of the increase in partners. MSM who report having four or more partners are twice as likely to contract HIV than those with fewer partners. And so, of course, there are going to be infections with needle use, but what the literature is really showing is that MSM seem to be, I think, perhaps from a lot of the educational initiatives and our good job in public health educating people on the risk of needles. For whatever reason, that seems to be working with this population, and it's more transmissions from sex.
We covered a lot of this, Ricky, so we can forward, but you will get a copy of this PowerPoint anyway, if you want to look at it in more detail.
Okay.
In terms of why Latino men who are MSM are using meth, again, sex and intimacy is something we all crave. Especially we feel isolated. We feel like, oh my gosh, I'm the only gay person who lives here, which happens a lot more than we think. These are all quotes from young men that we interviewed as part of our local study, who shared with us for over an hour or two in some cases about their experiences. And that is what helped shape this presentation. When I was using Tina once said, I used it for sex. If I wasn't having sex, then there wasn't a reason for me to use it. From a 22-year-old. It's hard for guys because they don't have the same sex when not partying. They can't even get the same quality of guys when they aren't partying. Sex is really boring without it, said one who was 27. A third one said it made it more wild and, sorry, a bubble came up on my computer. It made it more wild, and there are times where I question myself and I wonder, wow, I would not have tried that or gone that far if it wasn't for partying. It makes me want to have sex more and more with more people. It's like what I see in porn. And again, we heard that over and over and over again from young men of all ages.
All right. Continuing off of that, sexual pleasure is enhanced. To get more technical, it influences the dopamine, a neurotransmitter in our brain that activates the pleasure center. What happens with crystal and the dopamine is that one particular aspect of sex gets very exaggerated, which is the aggressive sort of animalistic kind of sex. That's from Dr. Stephen Lee. And so this disinhibitory nature of the drug makes it, again, a very appealing tool for aiding sex. And this has to be part of our conversation and it kind of at the forefront when we are engaging in these discussions. While MSM report having erection issues, with the availability of over-the-counter and prescription male enhancement medications, erections, are a non-issue. Multi-hour erections and multi-hour intercourses are another, positive thing for sex that meth provides. For many MSM who experience discomfort or shame when engaging in penetrative anal sex, meth allows them to feel uninhibited, and people are reporting that they feel sexy and that they desire penetration when they're high, when maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think, the shame, maybe Oscar, you can chime in here a little bit, is particularly, specific to, I think, the cultural aspects of working with Latinos.
I think it applies to both Latinos and in some cases also to African American MSM, in that
Yes.
we grow up hearing messages. They may be in our face, told by our parents. It may be heard as you walk down the school hallway. Many times they're disguised by all the times you get rejected online because you're too dark. Um, so that further exacerbates the problem, because if meth is what it takes for me to ignore those or to find people who are attracted to me, regardless of my ethnicity or race, then it's going to be worth trying.
Absolutely.
And somebody just asked, do women get sexually activated by meth? There's not a lot of research there, but I know of a few women in my lifetime when I was in New York and DC who smoked it. They didn't do it any other way that for sex purposes. Lots of women are addicted to meth, but I would say in smaller numbers than our MSM, and their consumption tends to be smoking and then injecting drugs as the next level.
Okay, other risks, situational risks. So these interviews that we're referencing, and we're going to talk about a little later, but we did a pilot program with over a dozen young men here in South Texas. And it's a program that is an evidence-based intervention, perhaps maybe the only one with actual evidence that it works to address this problem and accomplish some harm reduction. And in the entrance interviews, one thing that came up for a lot of them was this notion of situational risk. They show up for a hookup, and they're going to party and play, which is PMP, and they're surprised to find that there was more than one person waiting for them. They often felt a loss of control, but didn't want to leave because they weren't sure how much they could trust the person or people around them. And so, like, here's a quote: "I don't carry anything with me that can be stolen. I've gone places with no ID, no wallet, just some Tina, but not too much or we'll all get used." And adjacent, another situational risk is just what happens after, and how this impacts your employment, your housing, your relationships. Go ahead, Oscar. Oh. And one thing that I know there was an incident in San Francisco in terms of situational risk, but a lot of these young men were saying that they were solicited by much older men and that they had never encountered methamphetamines. That is how they were introduced to it, through hooking up primarily by older men with money who would pay them to come out and party with them. And then they show up and it's like, oh, there's all these other guys too. So, especially now with the precarious financial situations of a lot of people, I think this will become more common, that people are willing to do things for money and put themselves in these kind of situational risks.
The impact of HIV viral suppression. A 2019 study funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, surveying clinicians, nonprofits, and AIDS service organizations, among others, found that crystal meth to be the substance contributing most to the negative outcomes in HIV viral load suppression among HIV positive individuals over all other drugs. The following three slides will reveal the unique impact meth has on that. But as somebody who's worked at ASOs all his life, I can tell you that especially in the last 15 years, almost every single MSM that has fallen out of care has been because of meth use. And linking them back in is extremely hard, because by the time you get to find them, they don't have phones, they don't have ways to communicate. they're moving around from cheap motel to cheap motel, selling drugs or selling their bodies to survive. Stopping, and then of course, because they party, they sleep during business hours. So there's a need for after business hours and for more efforts to reach those populations because they are the most challenging to get back into care. And again, if they're HIV positive, not in care, and sharing needles or doing anything else like that, doing during party and play sessions, the harder it is for everybody.
So here are the results from this study. So, we did say that meth was indicated as the drug over all other drugs. And meth is actually #1 over alcohol in several states. But when you aggregate all the states, alcohol is still #1 with 41.4%. But you can see methamphetamine is actually outscoring opioids. And yet we don't have the same kind of infrastructure and funding and resources as we've put in for the opioid epidemic. This is showing you again, the next slide will be the Texas numbers, but you can see methamphetamine and how it is the negative health outcomes, such as for HIV, like retention in care, medical adherence, viral suppression, and you can see those scores. And I think this is a really great way to go to your funders and your decision makers and make this argument that we need to be putting an equal amount of resources to this specific issue. Here in Texas, you can see that again, methamphetamine use was ranked very, very, very high. All right, so the next few slides are, we do want to note that there is ongoing research on the effects of meth use related to HIV. Not only that, but in treatments. One of the challenges with meth is there is no medically assisted treatment the way that as it exists for opioids. There's no methadone, there's no magic pill. You go to a rehab and you're basically just left to detox without very much. And so that research is ongoing, everything from electrical brain stimulations to a combination of Wellbutrin with modafinil, which is, anyway, and the same thing with the research on how it affects HIV. So we selected about 3 or 4 different studies. This one's from 2015. The rest are from the last 2 years. Just to give you an idea that there, of course, we're not scientists, we're not doctors. You can take these studies and distribute them to the right people. But for example, this 2015 paper shows how meth may increase rates of HIV infection and is based on studies with animal models. One of these was a mouse study, which showed that meth upregulated the HIV-1 co-receptors, CXCR4, CCR5, not only on the CD4 plus cells, but on monocytes, macrophages, dendritic cells, and astrocytes. Data with cats and monkeys also implicated the CD4 effect. And so basically the drug and its implications on cellular pathways serve to make very clear that immune cells are more vulnerable to HIV attack. And so these findings support the observation that methamphetamine users with HIV frequently have higher viral loads than non-users because of the drug use itself. And that's compounded if they were in care and then they fall out because of their meth problem. Here is the kind of visual showing you how meth impacts T cells in the HIV immune response. Again, this is all will be available to you so that you can create your own reports with these. This year in 2020, this is in the Journal for Immunology, they found that meth enhances HIV-1 replication. Without getting too technical and for purposes of time, again, we just want to show you that this literature does exist. It's out there, it's ongoing. and it's something that we need to be very much aware about in terms of HIV care for our clients. Another aspect of meth is its impact on HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders, which is abbreviated as HAND. HAND was much more prevalent than it is now in the age before these kind of high-tech ART therapies, but we still do see them. So these neurocognitive disorders associated with HIV, essentially meth will exacerbate these. So an idea of what HAND is basically attention deficit disorders, impaired executive functioning, motor functioning, working memory, learning, earning, speed of information processing. And so while the neurons do not become infected with HIV, they are affected by viral proteins, inflammatory mediators, and neurotoxins chronically produced in the HIV-infected CNS. And so meth contributes to HAND by compromising the integrity of the blood-brain barrier and facilitates processes linked to neuronal damage. And here is a neat little visual kind of showing you the technicalities of how that works, of meth's role in exacerbating the neurocognitive effects of HIV. Okay.
In terms of the scope meth for use in Texas, because this is where we originated this presentation, just to share, as opioid overdoses and addiction take the spotlight across the country, crystal meth is quietly making its mark in many rural areas of the country, including Texas and the entire U.S.-Mexican border, from Brownsville all the way to El Paso. In our region alone, in the Rio Grande Valley, it's made up of 3 counties, 1.2 million people, the 2 poorest cities in the United States, with the busiest port in the United States, 14 bridges that cross into Mexico, and 1 ferry. And we have 144,000 people who live in colonias. So for us on the border, this becomes a bigger issue because people are afraid to leave their homes because of what's happening with ICE. The deportations, we have 2,000 people still sleeping on the floor in Matamoros on the other side of the bridge as asylum seekers because they can't be seen on the US side. And you can imagine what Hurricane Hannah did to them. But those of us here in this area of the Rio Grande Valley had more cases of HIV than the entire state of Kentucky and Connecticut combined, and yet we don't have the same kind of funding that those 2 states got. So how we share that money in the future should also look at what specifically is happening nationwide before it's broken down, in my opinion. Why isn't it getting the media attention that opioid addiction overdoses are receiving? Because crystal meth kills its users more slowly and because of who it's killing. Let me be really honest and go off the book here and say, if this was happening to white teenage and college students, this would be front page news. It'd be right after the COVID briefings on your newscast, but it's happening to brown and Black people. And it's not a priority. The CDC reports that the use of meth has increased 250% since 2011. The CDC also reports that fatal cocaine-related overdoses increased by 27% a year on average between 2012 and 2018. Deaths linked to psychostimulants, including meth, rose 30%. During the same period, nearly a 5-fold increase, many drug users injected both opioids and stimulants, further exacerbating the problem. A change in laws, control over certain over-the-counter substances used in the production of the drug has had a positive impact on lowering the rates of crystal meth production and use, but new methods of production have been created since that time. More portable methods that allow for quick setup and takedown, and the drug is very frequently being imported into the country from Mexico, Central America, and China. Unlike opioids, sorry, can't see my screen anymore. Unlike opioids, there is no proven medical treatment for meth addiction, as we stated earlier. Ricky, can I do this one real quick?
Sure.
So on the right-hand side, you'll see 3 5-gallon jugs of water, one would presume, that were crossed to the United States. That's liquid meth. That's largely what's being made available across the United States. And when it gets to its destination, finally, it's already been turned into shards and the actual Tina that we think of when we talk about this issue. But this is one of the ways it's transported nationwide and what it looks like. And it looks just like a 5-gallon bottle of water. We can do therapy and that sort of thing for people who are using meth, but we don't have a magic pill, said Jane Maxwell, who I love and adore, who researches drug abuse at the University of Texas in Austin. Maxwell has said Maxwell has documented a meth spike in Texas that includes a rise in deaths, treatment center admissions, and poison control calls, and toxicology lab submissions. She has stated that she believes meth is driving an uptick in HIV cases. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers in El Paso have reported huge seizures of liquid meth as of on February 13, 2020. Those 1,543 pounds of liquid meth seized was more than 3 times the 425 pounds of meth seized in El Paso in all of 2019. So that's a huge, huge increase. And for those of you who weren't here at the very beginning, sorry, I suffered a horrible illness. I'm trying to recover, and now I have COVID, presumably. So if I stutter, forgive me.
All right. Here in South Texas, we've seen notable increases amongst men who have sex with men testing for HIV and STIs who report meth as the risk factor for unprotected sex. Additionally, our online outreach efforts show a dramatic increase in the availability of meth and how it's being consumed. And so we're encountering growing numbers of young people who are exchanging sex for meth because of poverty, because of their need for intimacy, their desire for uninhibited sex. And so these are all high-risk situations. And uninhibited sex may include not using condoms, more than one partner, group sex, double penetration, ongoing sex for multiple days, being videotaped, exchange sex for money, housing. And unlike larger metropolitan areas, PrEP is still not as widely available as one might think, particularly in rural areas. And many still do not know it is available and affordable. So lack of availability of PrEP is primarily due to homophobia and lack of training on behalf of medical providers. Of course, this is not true for all areas of the country, but for significant parts it is.
And also to that point about, also to that point about, can you take back the slide a second?
This one?
Go back, there. No, there, okay. One of the challenges, again, regarding PrEP is that where these young men and men in general who have sex with other men are meeting other tricks, partners, is through our dating apps. And these same dating apps and even Facebook and other social media sites run advertisement constantly from legal supposed entities saying that if you've been on Truvada, join us and fight the lawsuit because of the damage to the liver or whatever. You can't imagine how many close to arguments I've had with young people that that's why we have Discovery now. I bet Truvada works for a lot of folks. It worked for me for 2 years before I switched over. But it's me arguing what they're constantly being barraged with, that PrEP does not work and will harm you. So we have to find a way to counterbalance that. Go ahead, Rick.
So we talk a lot about the health risks when we talk about drug use, but we learned that a top priority risks were the social risks. So for example, looks and appearance. We heard from people that meth was impacting their physical appearance, whether it was weight loss, their skin, or just looking ill. and the impact their appearance has on their social standing and their self-esteem. Here's a quote: "Meth messed me up. At the end of the day, it's like when your friends take notice, when your friends actually take notice of what you look like, what your face looks like, the marks on your face. Your face looks dried out, you look sick, you're sweaty, your teeth start to look bad. I mean, it definitely changes your appearance." And again, we already kind of alluded to situational risk, but we heard from nearly everyone that they had shown up to a situation and it was much different than what they were expecting. And so there's this feeling of a loss of control, uncertainty about how much they could trust the people around them. And then, of course, the loss of stability, these social determinants of health, which, as we all know, you cannot separate in our work. When we're in these discussions, in these dialogues, and in our interventions, we have to kind of have this intersectional approach. And then last is not being able to enjoy sex. And this is particularly important. You know, a lot of, certainly in rehab centers, from my experience and from a lot of people I speak with, this is not something that a lot of counselors are talking about with people recovering from meth addiction. Whether that is their, you know, how pornography is a trigger, or sex outright, how to rediscover intimacy without the drug. This is something that we definitely need to talk more about, because again, we're hearing that the sex is just much more pleasurable, more wild, inhibition free, and you know, every human needs connection, needs intimacy, and that's such a central allure of why this drug in particular has such a wide appeal.
And two quick things there, Ricky. One, in terms of enjoying sex, for many Latinos, even if as acculturated as they may be, there's that constant voice in your head that you heard the first time you act like a sissy, the first time that you didn't know how to use tools, the first time that you disappointed your father. It stays in you. And therefore, there's guilt around having gay sex, there's guilt around experiencing it, seeking it out. This drug allows you to push all that back and be sexually free. So that empowerment is really life-changing. Somebody asked me, asked in the chat to clarify what I meant by the social media platforms. I'm very, very lucky to join about 12 other Latino leaders from the US that has constantly met with the CDC for the last few years for input, for recommendations, and to be heard, honestly. And what we have said over and over again is that when the HIV epidemic was devastating us again in larger numbers, this was like the 90s, there was a federal national effort to get all the players in the room, the manhunts and all those sort of sites that existed back then, and have them regulate what was happening on their sites. That's gone away. Now most of the dating apps and Facebook, for example, show this advertisement. It's not just the dating apps, it's general used social media. But on the dating apps in particular, and on social media, there's no control of what's said, with the exception of Hornet, who does a pretty good job. The other ones get away with, well, if you accuse me of something, go look in this corner. There's a button that'll take you to another button, that'll take you to another button, that'll talk about the risk of HIV. That's not enough if they're the main way that people are hooking up and engaging in meth use and having sex. So it's time to call them out, quite honestly.
Yeah. All right. So some recommendations and lessons learned. First off, right at the top, we have to remember that if one of our main tasks is to destigmatize this issue, is that not all people who use meth are addicts. In fact, drug use is not inherently problematic. There are people who can use it in moderation, who can use it recreationally. But that being said, you know, this problem is so widespread that we've heard from many, many people that even service providers, outreach workers, public health workers are partying and hooking up with would-be clients. So we need to be vigilant about talking openly about this, but in a way that's non-judgmental. And, you know, to kind of extend on that, you know, our experience working with harm reduction programs around the country, we've seen while their marketing and their programming might signal that, you know, safe spaces, non-judgmental, it doesn't always correspond to the reality of their services, where, you know, maybe there's a lack of imagery or posters in their counseling and testing rooms that communicate open-mindedness. And even more nefarious is organizational cultures that don't allow for their employees to feel safe to report to their supervisors that maybe they themselves are having issues with substance use for fear of losing their job. And if we're gonna talk the talk, then we have to walk the walk in that regard. That, you know, if we're truly about destigmatizing this, then that should extend to our own staff and our own cultures at our organizations. And in that sense, I think all of us can benefit from more training on what true harm reduction looks like.
Can I say, just go back a second?
Sure.
For those of you who missed it, I admitted to having used meth in my lifetime, and I considered myself a recreational user, not an addict. I still consider myself to be in recovery because I had to stop. I chose to stop. But one of the problems that we encounter is that, again, admitting these issues is a challenge to your when you talk to your family, your circle of friends, if you still have a circle of friends when this is over. And then it's been mentioned in the chat room, how many of you are struggling to do online outreach? And it's true. I've tried it myself and immediately get banned forever. And not just the same profile. If I try to get it back again, they can tell where it's coming from and they will automatically block you. Grindr is particularly bad about that. Adam for Adam, you know, struggles, but is not so great either. And so it's important to go covert if you're going to go online. And there's ways to do that are ethical and ways to do that are unethical. I worked with an organization that chose to send somebody undercover, and they were attractive. When they were approached and before they came over to PMP or whatever, they were asked, when was your last HIV test? And can you show it and prove it? And they're like, no. And so an hour's worth of flirting with them was leading to, well, get tested and then reach out again. That bait and switch does not work. What will work, what we can provide you with later on as TA providers, capacity building providers, is how to do it right. It means putting somebody in there with their own image that passively shares this information when they get approached, as opposed, because you cannot reach out to people with this information because you'll be banned. So there's all sorts of ways to do it. But first we have to get all the directors of ASOs on board about why their presence on these sites is important and how to do it ethically, but also how to do it in a way that protects the agency from liability. And lastly, how do we protect our staff who we put in these sexually charged environments from sexual addiction? So going on to this one, it goes deeper than crystal meth, sex, and support services. This is about the impact of racism and homophobia that contribute to internalized stigma and challenges with building intimacy without the drugs. It's about filling attachment voids. Risks for Latino MSM are unique because of power dynamics at the intersections of race and class. Generally, people of color communities are under-resourced. People of color disproportionately impacted by housing insecurity, job access, policing, health disparities, access to education, you know all this stuff. But how crystal meth use has become a substitute for now meaningful, loving, and vulnerable connections, even though they may be short-term until meth runs out, it's still an attachment of being with another male in the same gender-loving sort of situation. And we have to show people even basic dating sort of guidelines and how to date and the difference between sex and romance, because we don't talk about it. We're so focused on just sex itself. We're not teaching people how to build healthy relationships. And that's another thing we need to work on. For medical recommendations for providers and healthcare workers. For medical and non-medical providers, clinical providers should be intentional about asking Latino MSM about crystal meth, brush up on some of the reasons that people use meth and the cultural context for use, again, party, play, intimacy, to be more well-rounded. Partners with providers who are already confident and have trust, rapport building skills will be the most effective. Connect with your local harm reduction programs if there's any in your region. I know there's none in ours. HIV service or LGBTQ centers, there's none in ours. And providers, other than outreach teams that may connect with this community. For providers asking about crystal meth, don't assume, always include crystal meth on your list of drugs you can ask about because of the perception that crystal meth is used largely by white people, people who come in looking strung out, Latino MSM who are using crystal meth even occasionally don't feel like there's a space to talk about their needs with providers unless they bring it up themselves, which is very hard to do. For educators, stigmatizing experiences perpetuate distrust. The only way to move forward is to be open and learn more about the diverse reasons why people are doing this. Allow them to connect to each other and experience intimacy without feeling shame. And in order to do that, we have to gather them in a room together. And that's really hard to do because the stigma around drug use is the same stigma that exists for being a person living with HIV. I did a group 2 years ago with 16 Latino MSM who are HIV positive under the age of 24. In order to get 16 of them to come to the room, I had to approach and interview and try to sell 99 people on it. From 99, I got 16. From 16, the amount of people that made it through the entire 12-week course, which they were compensated for, went down to 14. But all those 14 young men are still in care. They're taking care of the health. They're advocates in the community. And that really does work, even though it's a lot of labor. It's very labor intensive, but we have to make that effort in order to get to them. And to this point, we are providing you all an image that will be available tomorrow. It will be sent electronically to everybody. We created 2 posters, one in English, one in Spanish. It's perfect for putting up in a testing room. It's perfect for putting up in an exam room, linkage to care room, etc. That basically says meth causes a more aggressive sex drive, making us more susceptible to HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. If you PMP, know your tricks, treat them well, get tested every 3 months to know your status. Use a lot, and we're saying 3 months because their risk is higher than the normal where we say 6 months. Use a lot of lube whether you top or bottom, because that goes by the wayside when you're having a good time. Get on PrEP, stay on PrEP, and tell others about PrEP. If you're HIV positive, get and stay in HIV specialized care. And then to talk to someone, there's a white box where you will be able to, if you download these in color at your printer at the office, you'll be able to put a label there of who your office mate might be, who can specialize in this, who's versed in this, or their phone number, email, whatever. Underneath that is the SAMHSA resources available in English and Spanish. So you all will get these. They're free of charge. You'll also be able to download them from our site free of charge tomorrow at poderosos.org. But we want to not leave you with not one more tool. This is something that we think will at least invite people to be more open. And already there's so many posters and exam rooms and all this that people look at. I think this will stand out and say to folks, oh, I can talk to these folks. They get it.
Now, 8 months ago, the findings of an intervention were published, and it's perhaps the only intervention that we can do at our agency that has been proven to work. We plan on doing a training and a webinar that will get very in depth on this. One of the reasons that we're only briefly going to mention it here is essentially we did a pilot program. It's a 12-week program, but then COVID happened. And so figuring out how to pivot from an in-person recovery support program to something that's virtual, we are fine-tuning that so that we could roll that out, streamline it, make it so where it's easily replicable for all of you to do in your own regions. Essentially what it is, it's a 12-week program it's called a positive affect intervention. And essentially, one of the takeaways from the opioid epidemic and the solutions that we rolled out in different states was that recovery support services and peer mentoring programs really work. And one of the reasons they work so well is that one-on-one attention that you get, specifically from someone who's gone through recovery themselves. And that's what's so great about this program. They get that one-on-one sessions. And in addition to that, twice or 3 times a week, they submit urine for a urine analysis drug test. And if they pee clean, they get a financial incentives that through over the 12 weeks for every negative drug test, they can accumulate more and more money. And at the end of the program, they can earn anywhere. I mean, of course, you could tweak this to however you like. We did $350, and it works really well. The reason for that is because there is no magic pill for meth. To give a financial incentive combined with the counseling, it's again, the results speak for themselves. This is out of San Francisco. The San Francisco AIDS Foundation, they really pioneered this work. They've done a tremendous job, and we are, discussions with them about partnering again on a future training that will be all about rolling out this program, specifically in a post-pandemic world where there are challenges to participation and engagement when you don't get that one-on-one. So.
If I can jump in here, Ricky.
Sure.
In terms of recommendations for providers and healthcare workers, the intersections with mental health and homelessness are very important to note. Crystal meth use is complicated as a symptom of other needs, including unmet mental health, a sense of belonging, a need to connect and self-worth, as we discussed, as well as housing security and social stability. In our region, in the last 6 months, we've noticed a huge intake of meth use, specifically because of COVID. Right now, there's really no stability for people who are about to be evicted. Many of our clients are living in multi-generational homes. They feel the need to bring in income. And our local grocery chain in Texas is HEB. They're a behemoth. They produce all their own foods and steal other people's recipes and label it with theirs. It's that huge. It's the main employer for so many young MSMs. But you can make more money in one night selling your body to people using meth than you can in 2 weeks at a grocery store or at a restaurant. So we have to find a way to improve overall Latino stability and their access to care and their income if we're gonna really have an impact on this. Because if selling out your booty is gonna be a better source of income, you're gonna keep doing it for the sake of yourself or your family. Listen, refer, and follow up. We heard that one of the key parts is developing trust and rapport is to not let us fall through the cracks. Following up on referrals is helpful to be sure that your participant can get to the services they requested, and vet those services, please. Be culturally respectful and literate. Among Latino providers, machismo, homophobia, and faith are often at odds with how MSM live and love, as well as with MSM and meth use. I've had HR directors just sit me down and say, can I ask you how gay sex works? They've asked trans coworkers if they still had a penis. When they had a child, they asked, well, who's the father? Like, there's so much need to educate the people that work under our roofs in order to be then respectful to our clients. And all it takes is for one case manager, one outreach worker to be inappropriate, unintentionally or not, for that person to fall out of care forever from that organization. And if, like us, there's only one ASO in your region, you are royally screwed. I think that's all I want to say about this. It's just that there's a lot that we can do to improve, and we need to get there. We already showed you the posters earlier, but as we wrap up, I want to show this because it touched my heart. It took many years of vomiting up all the filth I'd been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on the earth as though I had a right to be here. And even as I say this, I tear up because for me and for many other Latino MSM who grew up hearing that we were an abomination, we were not something the family could be proud of. Go back to the other one, please. That's the core of this, is that you hear this constantly from the time you choose to play with your Barbies, your sister's Barbies instead of the tractor. We have to unload all that stuff. And I would challenge those online today that we have to do that at our agencies first, even let people, the staff talk about how they've grown up and what they've heard in order for us to make change that is impactful to our clients. Because it's that self-hatred, the lack of self-love, the fact of feeling unworthy that makes Latino MSM and Black MSM much more susceptible than other populations. And on that note, you'll hear more about us during the Q&A and with us, but we're gonna tag off to the wonderful, beautiful Sean Bland with the O'Neill Institute.
Great, thank you, Oscar. So my name is Sean Bland. I'm a senior associate at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. We're a research institute that's based at Georgetown University Law Center. We're going to speak for about 20 minutes. It'll be myself and Jeffrey Crowley, who's the director of the infectious disease initiatives at the O'Neill Institute. So I'm going to just hand it over to Jeff to give some opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I also just want to start by thanking the Texas Department of State Health Services for inviting us to join this webinar. And, just acknowledge our good friends and important colleagues, Oscar and Rick, who gave a great presentation. We always learn so much from them, but there was just so much good information we just heard. Sean's going to walk through the presentation, so I will be relatively brief. I just wanted to talk to you about why we engaged on this topic and really make some top line observations. At the O'Neill Institute, we run an HIV policy project together. And what we try to do is tackle timely HIV policy issues that really are pressing at the national level or such. And often we think our role can be to translate research into actionable policy recommendations, but also translate community perspectives on how to tackle an issue into actionable policy recommendations. We actually started working with Oscar a couple of years ago when we started doing some work on HIV prevention and care for Latinx, gay, and bisexual men. As we make progress with other groups, we've seen HIV diagnoses increase among Latinx, gay, and bi men, and we just felt that it was really important for us to highlight this critical issue and elevate the voices of Latinx leaders that are doing important work. Now, Sean and I are not drug policy experts. We actually work closely with colleagues at the O'Neill Institute that operate an addiction and public policy reform initiative. But we engaged on this issue earlier this year to highlight the need to focus more attention on people who use drugs in the context of the Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative. Both because this is an important initiative that hopefully will drive significant progress towards improving HIV outcomes, preventing new transmissions. And we just wanted to make sure that people who use drugs weren't lost in that conversation. But we also wanted to broaden the conversation that it seems like right now there's a lot of attention on opioid addiction, and that's a really critical issue, but broaden it to other forms of drug use that are especially important in the context of HIV prevention and care, with meth, of course, being at the center of that. And so we think that this type of webinar is critically important. Now, I did not see Oscar and Rick's presentation before this, and some of what they went over, I'm going to cover as well. So hopefully it'll be useful duplication. And I just want to make some observations. And maybe what I hope is helpful is that we've been given so much information. Sean gave more. How do we step back and say, okay, what do we need to remember and what do we do? And so I just have 8 points I want to quickly run through with you. So I personally have been working in HIV policy for more than 20 years. And one of the things that I've learned is that we need to ground all of our work in love for individuals and communities. Now, often I think many of us get focused on what we want people to do. We want people to reduce their number of sexual partners. We want people to use condoms. We want people to take their medications. I was once, when PrEP was first being rolled out, someone asked me, I want these young guys to use condoms. And I realized, like, what I want is for young gay and bisexual men to lead long, happy, and healthy lives. And I just think we need to step back and think that we do this work because we care about our communities. So what we need to do, and when we think about people who use drugs, including people who are dealing with addiction or people in recovery, is we've got to show them that we love them and we're there to support them. The second observation, and this was mentioned earlier, is nearly all of us have been taught from the youngest ages to fear drug use and stigmatize people who use drugs. So one thing we need to do is we need to unlearn some things, and we need to learn how to actively not stigmatize people who use drugs and think about our language. And we'll make mistakes, but this is an active process. We can't just say we want to be supportive and nice. We've got to unlearn some things. The third observation is that drug use can be harmful. So preventing harms associated with drug use is an important public policy goal. But at the same time, we need to recognize that punitive approaches and the war on drugs have failed us. So what we need to do is really embrace principles of harm reduction and really maximize the agency of individuals to make decisions about their own lives that work for them so that they can maximize their happiness and their health, right? And we need to think about what we're trying to do. If we're really trying to prevent harm from drug use, it's really about promoting the principles of harm reduction and increasing agency for people to take care of themselves. Fourth, I want to acknowledge that meth does produce harms for both individuals and communities. We heard a lot about that. And so I just think, what do we do with this? We need to give gay and bisexual Latinx communities better tools and supports for preventing meth addiction and minimizing the harm from their drug use. Both Rick and Oscar, but Oscar was so compelling as he closed about this that we need to offer more support. My fifth observation is that sexual health is important, but as a society, we really don't have fully developed conceptions of what it means to be sexually healthy for anybody, let alone a marginalized group of gay and bisexual men. And so what I think we need to do is really, and by example, if we talk about physical health, I think we all have some conception about what it means to be physically healthy. There's maybe a litany of things that run through our minds. We should sleep more. We should exercise. We should eat a healthy diet. We should limit our alcohol consumption. If I say I want us to be sexually healthy, many of us don't know what that means. So how can we achieve that if we don't know what it means? So what I think we need to do is establish regular, age-appropriate dialogues for Latinx gay and bi men to think about and learn what their goals are for healthy living and how sexual health fits into that. And really that should apply across the lifespan. The sixth point is that instead of just saying we think meth is bad, I think we really need to assess and try to understand why some gay and bisexual men choose to use meth. Often, as we've heard, it's to enhance sexual pleasure and to create a sense of missing community. And so I think what we need to do with that information or that understanding is we need to strive to give people that community, that thing they're missing without meth use. And we really need to validate sexual pleasure. As Rick was saying, sexual pleasure is a beautiful thing and it's important. So as people working in policy or in community-based organizations, we need to embrace this idea that, if we're going to be loving and supporting, we need to promote people maximizing their pleasure. Now, for people that have used meth, as we've heard, it also may mean we need to teach people new ways to have pleasurable sex without using meth and other substances. The seventh observation I'd make is that sexual exploitation of young gay and bisexual men is a problem that can be exacerbated by meth use. We heard a little bit about that earlier. There's a prominent case in Los Angeles with a Democratic donor, Ed Buck. But I believe research studies have shown, and I think Rick mentioned this from their experience, that we're starting to learn that, for other substances, whether it's alcohol, cannabis, young people know about this coming up and they're given information and they're often told either they should wait, they shouldn't use drugs, they should whatever. But for a lot of young gay and bisexual men, the first time they even are introduced to meth, it's on their first use. So that really indicates we haven't given them the education about what it is, how it works, why they should avoid it, or how it could impact their lives. So what I think we need to do is just be very aggressive in promoting or engaging more with young gay and bisexual men to give them non-stigmatizing, medically accurate information that helps prevent drug use or drug use initiation. And lastly, the last observation I want to make is that the challenge of meth use in gay and bisexual male communities is complex, and dare I say it's messy. So in the last administration, I was a political appointee and I dealt with some drug use issues. And just really from a political perspective, I understand that these are hard issues to touch. So people working in health departments, people that are working at nonprofits and have funders to keep happy, I understand the reasons why people don't want to engage in this, why it's easier to deal with some other issues that, that our HIV community is facing, but we have to deal with this. I would also say that progress is possible. I hope that we hear more about this, that even though it's challenging, people can recover from meth addiction. So I really, when I say all this, I want to end and recommend where I began. We need to show Latinx, gay and bisexual men that we care about them. And this really requires us to deal with these tough issues that, including drug use and seeking sexual pleasure, living sexually healthy lives. And that's how we'll ultimately produce healthier communities and really make progress towards ending the HIV epidemic. So I hope that's useful to you, but now I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to give you a broader perspective. Sean?
Great, thank you, Jeff. So I will first just start with our disclosures. The O'Neill Institute and Georgetown University receives grant funding from Gilead Sciences. I just want to say that the views expressed here are my own and not necessarily Georgetown or Gilead or anyone else's. So just some overview for what we're going to cover, give a little bit more background on the O'Neill Institute, and I'll provide an overview of the US HIV epidemic. I'll talk a little bit more about the work that we've been doing at O'Neill with Latinx, gay, and bisexual men. And then we'll talk a good amount on methamphetamine use in the US and its impact on HIV. And then lastly, I'll talk about the meeting that Jeff and I did earlier this year that was really focused on promoting the health of people who use meth and other drugs as we think about ending the HIV epidemic in the US. So just on O'Neill, we work at the intersection of health and law. I'm a lawyer by training. We work on a variety of thematic areas, including food and drug law and health and human rights. And I particularly work with the Infectious Disease Initiative, where I focus on HIV law and policy issues. And we work closely with our addiction and public policy team as well, as Jeff mentioned. So in terms of the approach of the work that we do, we integrate scholarship, policy, and practice. So scholarship being we do research, we publish in academic journals and law reviews in a very traditional sense. The bulk of our work, though, is in our research projects, which really are meant to kind of bridge the kind of scholarship with real world impact. And we're also involved with capacity building. And so we work very closely with health departments and community-based organizations. And in terms of our work with the infectious disease initiatives and specifically focus on HIV, we spend a lot of time doing consultation meetings, so bringing together diverse stakeholders to discuss issues. So we learn from community stakeholders, from policymakers and others, and we do our own independent research. And then we disseminate kind of our ideas and our recommendations in a variety of formats. A lot of it's published. So we do issue briefs, which are kind of longer documents that kind of provide policy recommendations and summarize key issues. We also do kind of big idea briefs, which are shorter and are less comprehensive, but still, I think, but focus on a particular policy issue. And then we also have these kind of quick take documents, which are kind of short 2-page infographics that convey kind of factual information for audiences who might not be familiar with a particular topic. And these are just some examples, and you can go to our website to see more of them. So just in terms of HIV, the US continues to have a very serious HIV epidemic. It's actually the most serious epidemic among developed nations. We have 1.1 million people in the US who are living with HIV and about 38,000 new HIV infections per year. We've seen some progress on HIV. So from 2008 to 2014, we saw new HIV infections decline by almost 20%. We've also seen increases in viral suppression, particularly within our Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, where we saw viral suppression increase in all groups. So groups based on race, gender, or risk group. However, the progress that we've seen has been uneven. And so we haven't seen the same reduction in infections among Latinx gay and bi men, among Black gay and bi men, and other populations, trans folks included. And we also know from surveillance data that progress has really stalled in recent years. So we do need to redouble our efforts. And particularly, we need to focus on those populations that are most impacted. So again, gay and bisexual men, particularly Black and Latinx, Black and Latinx communities more generally, Black women, trans women, and also people who use and inject drugs. And it's also just important to keep in mind just geographic. So the South is disproportionately impacted. In the South, which includes Texas, accounts for the majority of new HIV diagnoses, even though the South contain only 38% of the US population. And this is just the most recent data from 2008, where we see, again, about 2/3 of infections are among men who have sex with men. And once you actually add men who have sex with men who also engage in injection drug use, it's about 70% of folks of new infections are in that population. About a quarter of infections are through heterosexual contact. And really, if we're focusing on this topic, when we think about injection drug use, and again, meth can be used, not just through injection, but when we think about injection drug use, we have over 10% of new HIV infections are attributable to injection drug use, and that's an so when we look at data from 2014 to 2018, that's where we're seeing, that's one area in which we're seeing increases in new infections. So, I mean, Jeff gave a little bit of this information already, but just in terms of how we started working with Latinx leaders, starting in 2018, we reached out to a number of leaders just to say, hey, we see a need to have more focus on HIV prevention and treatment among Latinx gay and bi men. Would this be something that we could collaborate with you on? So we collaborated with Vienna Star Human Services, which is a community-based organization in Los Angeles. And we convened a meeting that was focused on this topic. Something that was really special about the meeting, we had about 30 stakeholders who came. So we had folks at Vienna Star from the Latino Commission on AIDS attend. But we also brought in a lot of new folks, and particularly a lot of younger folks who are Latinx, gay and bi men from across the country. And I think it was really important to kind of hear about the work that they're doing and the issues that they're facing. From that, we did a number of national conference calls with Latinx leaders where, again, we were going to move forward with our research to develop a report, but I thought there was a need for more attention to this issue, and the attention that they brought to it was to have their own community-led call to action. So through those conference calls and through another in-person meeting, we supported the development of that call to action. It was ultimately released in February of last year, and since then it has been signed by over 100 individuals and organizations. And then we released our policy brief as well. So this is just the graphic for our policy brief, and really one of the big takeaways from it was just the numbers, really. 1 in 5 new HIV diagnoses in the US in 2017 were among Latinx, gay and bisexual men. And we also saw that there were increases in new infections in that population, so an increase of 12% between 2012 and 2016. And then we also laid out some policy actions that need to be at the center of our response. So really, again, making sure we focus on the HIV prevention and care needs of Latinx, gay and bi men, making sure we're addressing social determinants, so things like immigration, but also mental health and substance use, making sure that we're supporting migrants and immigrants, and continuing to cultivate and support emerging Latinx leaders. And a lot of the recommendations that we came up with actually mirror in a lot of ways what was in the community-led call to action. So here are just some of them. These are the kind of the primary kind of demands were around kind of immigration issues, but also making sure that we set targets for improving the health of Latinx, gay and bi men within the National HIV/AIDS strategy, making sure that populations also prioritized within the Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative, and also demanding increased funding both for HIV prevention and for treatment. And I just put in this next slide, really in the red box, you can see a particular demand to fund comprehensive, stigma-free, culturally and linguistically competent, evidence-informed and right-based programs that include HIV, but also include mental health and substance use. And so I think that's just really important to call that out. That was, again, this call to action was released at the beginning of last year. And then, and even well before, knowing that, again, we have to address the comprehensive health needs, including substance use. So when we think about methamphetamine, again, it's a significant public health concern that's often ignored, and we need to continue to elevate discussion about it in our communities, in the media, through social media, in discussions with health departments and with state and federal officials. So we need to continue to have things like this to highlight this issue. Again, we know from data from the National Institute of Drug Abuse that approximately 1.6 million people in the US report using meth in the past year, and a significant number of those have also used in the past month. And we know that meth is increasing. So again, an estimated 964 million people aged 12 and older have a methamphetamine use disorder in 2017, and that's an increase from 2016. So again, it is increasing. And another kind of major concern is around kind of overdoses, and particularly overdose deaths involving meth, which are increasing in many parts of the country, including in Texas. We know that from 2007 to 2017, that overdose deaths that involve the category of drugs that include meth increased by 7.5 times. And we know in terms of all overdoses in 2017 that 15% of those overdoses involved the methamphetamine category. And of those deaths, 50% also involved an opioid. And so it's really important, again, to think about not just meth in isolation, but meth in the context of polysubstance use. And already mentioned that we don't have effective medication-assisted therapy for meth. So this is just data that came out last month, just provisional numbers from 2019, but still showing the same trend of increasing overdose deaths. So we have over 16,000 deaths that involve stimulants such as meth. And I think a really big takeaway here is that we actually are seeing more overdose deaths from meth than from heroin or for common prescription opioids. Okay, so that's just, I think, a big takeaway. I mean, when we think about other opioids like fentanyl, that's still driving a significant number of overdose deaths, but meth needs to be part of the conversation. It can't just be about opioids. Oscar and Rick alluded to this, but really we're seeing a spike in overdoses and overdose deaths also amid the COVID-19 crisis. So we have emerging evidence that suggests that continued isolation and also really all the economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the shutdowns and disruptions in the drug trade are actually fueling a surge in drug overdoses. And really when you think about not isolation, economic impacts that impacts mental health. It can, obviously lead folks to use drugs more. In many cases now, in terms of the stay-at-home orders, you may be using drugs by yourself, so you might not have someone around with you in case you do overdose to make sure you get the medical attention that you need. And so nationally, we're seeing that suspected overdoses from all drugs, so not just meth, jumped 18% in March of 2020, 29% in April of 2020, and 42% in May of 2020 compared to the same months last year. I won't go too much in depth here, but we do, and some of this has already been said, but really needing to focus on meth use among MSM and particularly the implications for HIV infection and also for STDs more generally, and really needing to focus on chemsex. We have just a study that came out a few years ago in 2018 that really looked at MSM who inject drugs, including meth, and their risk for HIV infection, just to see really where are the HIV risks. Is it from sexual behavior or injection behavior? And from that study, we really saw that most of new infections were being explained by sexual risk. So as Oscar mentioned, MSM who are using meth, are going to needle exchanges, so they're not sharing syringes. They don't really share with partners, and so that is something we still need to have. We need syringe services. We need harm reduction, but we really also need to address the sexual components, which meth is used in, the sexual context in which it's used in. Again, PrEP is really important. We need to increase access and adherence to PrEP. I'll just reiterate that stigma is very important. It is a barrier to PrEP engagement across the continuum. And again, stigma associated with multiple identities. So associated with your sexual behavior, so being a gay or bisexual man, associated with HIV or HIV risk, associated with using drugs. All of those need to be addressed. And this is also the El Paso study that Oscar already mentioned, so I'll skip that, but really showing that we really need to focus on particularly meth and sexual risk among Latinx MSM. So I guess the last part of the presentation is really just the work that we've been doing this year at the O'Neill Institute. So again, we convened a consultation in February that was focused on HIV and drug use epidemics. The goal was really to understand issues and opportunities for promoting the health of people who who use drugs as part of the Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative. And that's an initiative that was announced by the Trump administration last year, setting the goal of reducing HIV infections, new HIV infections, by 75% in 5 years and by at least 90% in 10 years. That initiative is centered around 4 pillars: diagnose, treat, prevent, and respond. Prevent includes obviously preventing new infections by using things like pre-exposure prophylaxis or syringe services programs. The initiative has a geographic and a population focus. So it's focused geographically on 75 jurisdictions. So 48 counties, Washington, DC, San Juan in Puerto Rico, and 7 states that have a substantial HIV burden in rural areas. So focus on those communities because they account for the majority of new HIV diagnoses in the US. And then also there's a population focus on the populations that I mentioned in particular, which include Latinx, gay, and bi men. I'll wrap up here so we have some time for discussion, but really I think a big focus for us was how do we obviously address policy levers and barriers to make sure we have meaningful access to health services, but also how we build and sustain support for those services over time. And I hope we can have some discussion about that. And this is just a list of the diverse stakeholders who attended the meeting. It was really great that we had both HIV advocates as well as harm reduction organizations at the meeting. And just some takeaways. Again, we need to have people who use meth and drugs more generally at the focus of our efforts. In particular, we need to focus on use among Black and Latinx MSM and to adapt our prevention approaches for those populations. We must address stigma and other social determinants of health. So that includes the criminalization of drug use, as well as immigration, poverty and housing, contingency management. So that was mentioned by Rick, a drug treatment approach that rewards positive behaviors. And so it's not based on abstinence, but individuals can set their own goals around reduction. That has been found to be a very successful intervention for people who use meth. So we need to have all of our jurisdictions working to expand access to contingency management and to syringe services programs, as well as to implement innovative models for addressing the health consequences of drug use. Things like medically supervised overdose prevention sites are often called safe consumption sites as well, which are an evidence-based approach. And then just this is the last slide, highlighting PROP, which was also mentioned. So again, Positive Reinforcement Opportunity Project, which is was developed out of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. The big takeaway from PROP is that it's effective for people who use meth. So they saw in 1 year of the PROP program that 63% of the participants in the program stopped using meth entirely, and another 19% reduced their use. So that's a major takeaway. So again, that's all of my remarks, and hopefully we can have some time for some discussion.
Thank you so much, Sean. I am going to go ahead and field some of the questions that I've been collecting throughout this webinar. Thank you for those of you who have been sending in questions. Please continue to send in any questions that you have. My first question is, how do we cross over into mainstream public awareness?
So I think Oscar, I think you're muted.
Yeah. You'll unmute yourself, Oscar. There we go.
Okay, thank you. How do we get there? I'm going to share real quick quotes. Emma Gonzalez, one of my heroes, said, "We call bullshit, and it's time to do so," regarding policies, regarding the needs of our people. Fannie Lou Hammer said, "Be inconvenient." Eleanor Roosevelt, "Use your privilege to sow justice." "Let us be clear, our house is on fire," came from Greta Thunberg. Take up space from Rosa Parks. And lastly, from Dolores Huerta, a personal hero, "Organizamos," get organized. The fruit of leadership and the permanent change is how the community and how grassroots democracy work. So after today, I'm hoping that this is the start, kickoff to something greater. For those of us on here who are interested, can join forces and meet regularly, discuss this, move our agenda forward, because this issue has been silent, and many of us who are on this have also been silent to the crisis. And it's time to just raise our voices. We're going to be speaking about this at the Biomedical Conference, and God willing, if allowed, at the US HIV/AIDS Conference as well, and the SYNC Conference. But yeah, we need to basically organize and start with your agency. Start meeting with the executive directors, unless you're that person already, with leadership within your organization, and get that harm reduction training happening immediately. And then I think they need a separate training on meth specifically because of how HIV is being spread. So that'd be my recommendation.
And I would just add, we need to also, everything that Oscar said is absolutely right, but we also need to make sure that we get this conversation outside of just the HIV realm. So, we need funding going to HIV organizations to have these discussions, but we also need funding going outside of public health, and we need to have public awareness campaigns, social media campaigns. We need to make sure that this is reaching as many people as possible, and we need to hold our elected officials, as well as all the kind of federal and state agencies accountable, not just HIV, but also at the federal level, SAMHSA, which oversees substance abuse programs, they need to be dealing with HIV prevention. They need to be dealing with meth. And so that's also part of the solution.
Thank you. Next question is, what are ways to facilitate MSM having experiences of connection and intimacy without shame in therapy? Wondering what the role of sexy therapy is here in healing sexual behaviors and association. So ways to facilitate Latino MSM having experiences of connection and intimacy without shame.
So a couple of things. One is make sure your organization, if they can, has therapists on staff. Who most often they're hired to deal with people who are positive, but people who are negative and at high risk need that. The CLEAR programs seem to be working really well with meth here locally. But we need to make sure, again, that the staff that are doing CLEAR are versed on this topic. Two things that I've tried that have worked really well, let me focus on one, I guess, is for years, I've been holding retreats for gay men of color and gay Latinos in particular, where we take 24 men away on a camping trip, if you will. We have cabins and everything else. And for a whole weekend, Friday through Sunday, we talk about these issues. We allow ourselves to lay next to each other in a non-sexual way and experience that breath, that being held without it being sexual. We talk about where the oppression comes from, the impact that machismo has on us, thinking that, like, okay, it's okay to be gay as long as you're the top. But don't bottom, because then that makes you a woman, and that's worse than being gay. No offense to Latinas. And meth allows men to bottom and to feel guiltless. We need to be having those conversations. And the best way to do it is not only through advertising and social media and posters, but to bring small groups of people together over a 3-day period, have it ingrained, and have them then be your peer leaders in the community. And that grows and grows and grows. We've done about 12 of these, and they work fantastic.
Sean or Jeff, do you guys have anything to add?
I don't know.
No, I think he really covered it, to be quite honest.
Thank you. So the next question, it says, you mentioned that Grindr bans people for advertising health services. Have you had any positive experiences promoting treatment services on hookup apps specific to meth?
No. They require you to buy advertising, which is extremely expensive. And if you are a year-long member for like $120 or something, you won't see those ads. The majority of people of color, young people, poor people, can't afford $120, so they'll pay their smaller fees monthly or access it for free. But after every like 6th person you contact, you'll get a pop-up ad that promotes something. But we've all been trained to just click the little X in the corner. It goes away, you can go back to hunting. So it's not effective. So when I was living in New York, being able to meet with the New York State Department of Health, with some folks from the CDC, we were actually able to get the players from those sites at that time at the table. And I think it's going to take something of that nature with leadership from our feds, maybe calling them in to speak to community members to get them to hear us. Because as the poster that promoted this says, the house is on fire.
Good point. Any additional comments on that, Sean or Jeff?
I mean, I think Oscar answered it perfectly. But I mean, just in terms of our role, again, we do a lot of consultations where we engage folks at the federal level at CDC, HRSA, SAMHSA. I think having those folks at the table is something that we will definitely be thinking about for going forward. But also, those types of convenings need to be hosted by our federal officials as well.
Thank you. I've actually got two more questions, and these are specific to the O'Neill Institute. Does the O'Neill Institute have educational materials on these subjects that folks can access?
So I'll jump in. So as Sean said, all our materials are available for free download on our website, so you can get them there. Sean referenced the convening we had, and we're working on a brief. It's not yet out, but we did publish last year our brief on HIV prevention and care for Latinx gay and bi men. We encourage you to look at that. But we have other materials on topics ranging from the STI crisis to scaling up access to PrEP to other issues beyond meth use that might be interesting to the people on this webinar.
Thank you. And the second question, they were asking for tips on incorporating your recommendations into community organizations such as FQHCs. I think this was during the time you were talking, Sean.
I think that one's really, well, I'll let Sean go first, but that's an important one.
No, Oscar, I mean, I think you probably could speak a little bit more to this. So feel free.
So our FQHCs are the main providers of healthcare, for those of you who don't know, for low-income folks. They're hard to get into, and they're not always user-friendly. So if you are the queer LGBT authority in your community, I think it's about organizing and meeting with their leadership and saying, we can't do it all. You'll already see so many of our people who are at risk, who are low income. We'd like to impart what we know. We'd like to ask for help. Sometimes it's better to ask than demand. And if that doesn't work, then you demand the hell out of it. But, and organize. But I think you have to get to the leadership and provide them with similar trainings and ask them to, what can they do? How can they meet you halfway? How can we partner together? Whether it's referrals back and forth. And when they don't do what they're supposed to do, I'd call them out publicly. I'm a peleonero, so forgive me.
Melissa, I noticed in the chat, someone had asked about testing your methamphetamine for fentanyl.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's first of all, that's a great point for one of breaking down barriers, starting conversations. If you can encourage that people test their own drugs, that's a really great way of signaling that we are pro harm reduction, pro safe use. There seems to be debate on are these Mexican drug cartels putting fentanyl intentionally to create like a secondary addiction, or is fentanyl just sneaking into the meth supply because it's weighed on the same scales? I'm not sure, but just testing drugs in general, I think is definitely key components to harm reduction and to having those conversations. And then another question I saw in the chat was, will there be future training on these contingency management modules like PROP in San Francisco? Absolutely, there should be. Hopefully Sean and Jeff can help us collaborate with those people, the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, to create a training for a future date, particularly with a virtual component to it in case, well, in the event that it seems most likely that this pandemic will continue. Absolutely stay tuned. That is definitely a big priority for us. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. We did have a clarifying question that also came through the chat about if you would describe or clarify a clean room. What a clean room is. Clean room?
Who said that?
It came in privately. If it doesn't make sense, we can.
No, not who, but who said clean room?
I was assuming that one of you guys did. I'll see if I can get more information here. Let's move on to my next question. which is, can you guys talk more to the impact of machismo, family, faith, and other cultural issues in treating Latinx clients who are using meth?
Well, let me expand and say, how do we work with, I already talked about machismo a little bit. How do we work with our faith-based groups? And one way we did it in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas is when we organized our first Pride ever in 2013. People were really scared to join and come out in the daytime at 3 p.m. We were lucky to get 300 people, but they loved it. There were moms, dads, kids, and plenty of gay and lesbians, bisexuals, you name it. It went so well that in 2014, that went up to 900, 2015 went to 2,000. And in 2019, this past year, we had 15,000 people in attendance. But for the past 3 years, starting back with the Orlando massacre, and when we lost one of our local trans Latinas who has been kidnapped, and 2.5 years later, we can't find her or raise money to support the reward. We brought them in again and again. Recently at the last Pride, same thing. I reached out to the bishop of my Catholic church, Latino. I was nervous about going in there, and I pleaded and I said, our people are hurting. They keep hearing messages that they're not accepted, not welcome, that God made a mistake, that being who you are, true to yourself, is not appropriate within the Catholic Church. And they sent me a priest who had worked previously in HIV in New York at St. Vincent's, where most people with AIDS went to die. And he's compassionate, wonderful, bilingual. And every year he comes and speaks briefly and then prays over the audience. To see 15,000 people sobbing when a priest in his priestly attire says, God doesn't make mistakes. God made you just exactly how you are. You are not a problem, you are a blessing. And everybody sobs, myself included. Is life-changing. We have to work with our local churches on both HIV and what it's doing to the queer community.
Thank you, Oscar. We had a question come from the live stream of YouTube. It is hard to engage people to enroll in PrEP because there are no clear answers on the lawsuits. I work in prevention and do not want to cause harm. How has the lawsuits affected the Ready, Set, PrEP program?
And we touched on it briefly, but I think it's hurt us a lot because before they even come in, they've already been inundated with the messages. When they leave and they're taking medication, they see these messages and they wonder, and often do stop taking their medication. So we have to make sure that the staff who tests them and makes the referral to PrEP, and the PrEP navigators who get them on PrEP, and the doctors and nurse practitioners, et cetera, continue to reinstate the message that that yes, you're going to see advertising but I'm the professional. I'm telling you, I'm not making money like those lawyers are. I'm telling you the truth. Yes, over years, this can be harmful, but that's why we do labs every 3 months. And the minute there's an issue, you will know. And then we can transition you to something else. And now most people are doing Descovy, which is much easier on one's liver. But those conversations aren't happening in the exam rooms or anyplace else. And I think that's where we need to get to. And then those of us who do outreach need to promote that. Don't listen to all the bullshit. Come and speak to an expert before you decide.
If I could jump in. So I'm trying to think that there's probably so many resources, I'm not sure where, but a number of the national groups have tried to push back to some of these lawsuits. And maybe it's the PrEP for All campaign that might be a place to look. But I think a number of the national groups have tried to speak with one voice on the safety of PrEP, the importance of it. And, perhaps we can add later to the chat or something information on how to find some of these resources too.
Sure,
and I would say advertise, and that's expensive. Billboards are beyond belief in terms of expense, but they're effective. On October 14th, for National Latino AIDS Awareness Day, BIV is going to be announcing, as part of their positive action, a new campaign for Latino MSMs. Specifically, they've been meeting with a group of us, 20 of us, for a year and a half, done focus groups across the country, 2 in South Texas, and they've developed a grant proposal and information that'll be made available. Apply, please apply. The BIV grants are lengthy, but not impossible to do. You can ask of upwards of $100,000 and use that money to promote PrEP, to educate the FQHCs, to educate the community. Please. Don't compete against me.
All right, next question. Is there any information on meth use among Latino trans men?
Jeffrey and Sean, you want to feel that?
To be honest, I really can't answer that. You know, this, as we said, this is not our area of expertise, but
I'm not aware of any. That is definitely, I think, again, a major gap in terms of just research on trans health, and particularly trans health research focused on trans men. I know one of the researchers that we've worked with in the past, Tonya Poteet, has done a lot of work, particularly on trans health, including on trans men. I can look and follow up with folks and share it in the kind of the resource email if we find anything.
So 2 things there. We are in negotiations with Achieving Together to put together a transgender version of this and overall HIV that we hope will come to fruition this year, and all of you will be invited. The other thing is that my personal experience from having initiated and supported our trans community in developing their own support groups. The first one only had 3. Now we have them in almost every city, region that we have down here in this region. And what they've told me anecdotally, the facilitators, is because they've been trained on what's right and wrong and good and bad. How many trans men, trans women already are driven to sex work, so that's an issue. But how many trans men are engaging in unprotected sex with other men because they feel like, well, I'm not a gay man, I'm not susceptible anymore. But unless, I mean, penis and vagina still equals the same thing.
Thank you. I've got one more question for you guys before we wrap up here. How critical is addressing meth use to efforts to decrease or end HIV?
so if I could start, and maybe others have more to add. Earlier in the HIV epidemic, drug use, particularly injection drug use, was a much higher share of new cases each year. We've made major progress with access to sterile syringes. It declined dramatically. Now I think we're at about 10% of new diagnoses are associated with injection drug use. But as with all these things, if we let up in any area, we'll see a reversal. And that's what we're worried about, both with injection drug use, but other forms of drug use, as we're saying in the meth conversation, really in ways that can increase sexual risk. So I think if we're trying to comprehensively end the HIV epidemic, we need to go where the population's at greatest risk and then comprehensively meet their needs. So we can't think we're doing great things just by focusing, for example, on PrEP services and other things if we're not addressing these other related issues around drug use and meth. So I would say it's critically important.
I would say, Melissa, that unfortunately, PrEP services have made many of our organizations lazy, because now we can offer people a pill without having to deal with all their baggage. I call bullshit. It ain't enough.
Sean or Rick, you have anything to add to that before we close?
I don't know.
A lot of people, Melissa, asked how can they get a copy of this? I know you said this at the beginning. Everybody's going to get a copy and access to the recorded version. You'll have copies of the PowerPoint. Tomorrow, depending on how COVID does in my body today, tomorrow or the next, you will all get an e-blast that will have our resources and the free posters that we showed you to download. And then once you have our contact information, reach out to us, to the O'Neill Institute, and ask for help. It's what we do. So thank you.
So I want to take, hi, I'm Rosa, and I want to take the opportunity to thank y'all for joining us and take the opportunity to thank our presenters. And it's been a wonderful afternoon to listen to the information that you shared. And thank you for challenging us with this topic. and to think about what the future holds, and to think about what this means for us. So thank you all very much, Austin and Rick, and Jeff and Sean. Thank you all for your time and for your energy.
Can I say one last thing, Melissa, if I could? Oh,
Yes.
Rosa, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
One question that I got a lot leading up to this presentation was, were we going to address HIV positive people who work in this field, who use meth and lure young people in without giving them full education? That came from 5 young men who are now HIV positive and extremely resentful that these men are still in the field even though they've caused this. And to that, you have my empathy. I'll always support you. The challenge is that, one, we're all human. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we don't have the courage to go back to those folks, or don't know how to reach them to say, I'm sorry, I wish I could do things differently. But before that person can tell you their situation, they've got to work on their stuff. And if they work in this field, super important, all administrators need to make sure that their spaces, again, are safe enough that people can talk about this, so that they themselves are not leading to other people becoming infected. And let's face it, our ASOs, our community health organizations have a lot of our people working there. We're blessed that that's one of our largest employers, but we can't assume that just because they work for us, that they're going to be careful with their own personal activities.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Poderosos and to the O'Neill Institute. And we hope that everybody who's joined us will join us in future webinars. Thank you.
I also would like to thank the Achieving Together conversation series and members of the Texas HIV Syndicate for putting this forward. Thank you. Thank you all for your time and joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Much love.
Stay safe.
Oscar, get well.
Thank you. Anita Barbida and some veladoras.
You know they've been on over here.
Thank you. Do we log off, Melissa, or stay on with you?
It is up to you. If you haven't had enough of me yet, you're welcome to stay on.
Just for maybe a quick catch up.
How do we do, guys?
Good. I'm gonna go ahead and
Give me just a second here.
yeah, let's I'm gonna get it down to just us if y'all don't mind.
God bless everybody. Thank you.
God bless everyone.
Or not God, if you don't believe.
Thank y'all. Thank you everyone for joining us.
The goddess.
It's gonna take me a minute.
I'm working with you on this side too.
Oh, okay.
So we'll see. Fast as we can. You made it through, Oscar. I know you were worried.
Yeah, I'm about to collapse. I ate half a banana today. That's something.
Oh no.
Look, there's a Christopher Allen.
There is.
Well, Oscar, I'm going to hop off, but please, if you need anything going forward, let me know. I'm available by email or phone. You know how to reach me. And thank you all for organizing this.
Thank you, John. We appreciate it.
Have an opportunity to work with you in the future as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Almost. There.
Okay.
All right, Rick, I think you asked how you guys.
Wait, Catherine, can you shut down the live stream?
Oh, yeah. And the recording.